Our third speaker tonight is Chris Curtis, who's going to talk to us about the impact of the proposed project on the community amenity and property prices, something dear to many people's hearts in this room. Chris is the Principal and Managing Director of Curtis Associates, which is a leading property advisory firm and buyers agency based in Sydney. Formerly a barrister for 16 years, practising in high-level property, commercial, finance and building law, Chris left the law and became a director at Macquarie Bank, where he was responsible for conceiving various Australian commercial and prestige residential real estate opportunities before going on to establish Curtis Associates in 2008. In his own right, Chris has been a buyer, seller and developer of residential, commercial, investment and hospitality properties for over 30 years and has been a property advisor and exclusive buyer's agent since 2007. Chris has spoken at various property market gatherings, including government inquiries, addressed think tanks, community groups, and his views are published by numerous media outlets, including 7:30, Four Corners, the Australian Financial Review, the Australian, Sydney Morning Herald, Domain, and lots of others. In addition to recently addressing over 100 Northbridge citizens on the impact of the tunnels and ventilation stacks on property, Chris's company in August 2017 published a special report entitled Sydney's Tunnels, Stacks, Electric Vehicles and Driverless Cars. Please welcome Chris Curtis.
Thank you for that introduction, and to all of you for coming tonight, and to the precincts, the registry precinct in particular, for your input in putting all this together. And also thank you to the two first speakers, which from my part I found both compelling and also very useful to set the context within which my presentation will be made, to add some of the science and the engineering to what I'm dealing with, which is some of the commerce manifesting as it does in the world of property, which is of intense interest to everyone, it seems, who lives in Sydney. What we have there is, from courtesy of the government, is the area that you all love and know so well, that may be compromised by these stacks if they're built. That shows the Warringah Expressway coming in from the north side to the south side. So tonight's talk from me will be with a focus on the 5 precincts who are most intimately involved with this evening's gathering tonight. The ABC, as many of you would have seen last year, provided this sort of graphic as a rough illustration of where the areas most proximate to the 3 of the 4 lower North Shore stacks are located, and I think that was a useful graphic in terms of the position of those stacks relative to these precincts. Acting as we do in advising people on property acquisitions of all types, whether it's residential or commercial or industrial, the topic at the front of their minds at the moment is the infrastructure initiatives that are going on in New South Wales and the risk that they represent to the quality of the investment. The focus, and it is our focus, I suppose, generally as advisors, is to see these initiatives, if we can call them that, as sources of risk more than an opportunity. So in the last decade, these sorts of things that we've found and we've noticed have become far more important to people considering making these vast investments and sums of money in Sydney real estate. So looking at the upside potential, again, always focusing just here on the property side of things, for residential and commercial property, particularly in these 5 precincts, what is the upside for these precincts? If these 2 projects go ahead in general, and these 3 stacks or 4, there is the one outside of the area of these 5 precincts, if they are actually built. Doing the very best that we could, all we could see was a possible reduction, theoretically, of Harbour Bridge and Harbour Tunnel traffic. That on the theory that some of the traffic that's heading, for example, southbound might now be diverted from the existing routes and be using these tunnels, and conversely those coming in from the west heading north, bypassing the city and going off to Rozelle, might end up reducing some of the traffic that you're currently experiencing on the Warringah Expressway and through the tunnel. The trade-off of that, of course, is that you are likely to be getting, if the modelling is right to the extent there has been any in scoping report, instead of that you're actually just substituting these three odious stacks. So is the net effect zero? Is this a zero-sum game? So another particular positive may be quicker access to the northern beaches. Now that's a nice thing from a lifestyle point of view. Would it have an impact on property, residential, commercial, and there's no industrial in these 5 precincts, but there is industrial close by, certainly in Artarmon. Would quicker access in these areas to the northern beaches materially affect property values and prices either up or down? In our view, the answer is no, it's too remote. Doubtless there'd be lots of people who would love the idea of getting to Palm Beach or at least any one of the 5 or 6 beaches on the northern peninsula quicker than they do now. Would you therefore pay more for a prestige piece of real estate in North Sydney as a consequence of that? And the answer would be no, in our view. So it is difficult from a property perspective to figure any upside to this proposal, these 2 projects. Secondly, in terms of industrial in these precincts, there are none, so it just doesn't apply.
Could you move away from the mic a little bit?
Thank you. Sorry. From the as a general proposition, therefore, from a property perspective, the inference is that these projects exist or are being proposed more for the benefit of the northern suburbs than they are actually the suburbs such as yours through which they will be passing and underneath which they will be passing. Downside risk for residential and commercial properties in these precincts. Again, these are theoretical risks. Reduced property prices. It's important in this circumstance, and here we actually are well served with some anecdotal and now some researched evidence coming through on the impact of, for example, the West Connects project on the suburbs that have been affected and are being affected by that project. So we found it useful to break it down into 3 categories, and we're not unique in this regard. That is impact on property prices before actual commencement of the works. In other words, when the announcement is made, typically in the lifestyle of these projects, in the life cycle. Then during the construction of these particular projects, and then after construction. So breaking those down from before construction, what we find and have found in advising people over the years is the fear of the known unknown can depress prices along the proposed route and close to proposed stacks. And I should really add there too also the proposed portals. You find there's a period of time where these people and people contemplating buying and selling, of course, as you're in this phase now, there's no definition as to exactly where these 3 pieces of infrastructure components are going to be located. Buyers and people who are interested in investing in property therefore ask the question, how close is too close to a tunnel, a portal, an entry or an exit, and to a ventilation stack? And at that point, when you're advising people, you know, should you, particularly younger families who are concerned about children and that sort of thing, and the impact, as Ray has gone through in great detail and very useful, the impact that might have. And I raise a case in point, and we've encountered many people like Ray who, you know, have moved away from these things because of the risk they perceive they pose to young lungs. There's studies everywhere. The one that we've found that comes closest to actually committing itself to a safe distance is a study in about 2004 by Arup. I'd make no comment on, 2014, I'd make no comment on the correctness or otherwise of it, but there was a general consensus in the discussion that something like 300 metres is a safe distance from a tunnel itself in terms of being built over the top of it, in terms of vibration, or just being close to it. Portals, nobody will provide a figure on that. The ventilation stacks, and this statistic has come up in Noel's address, that the Hibbard study in 2003 where there were recorded instances of effects of particulates 600 metres to 1 0.2 kilometres from a ventilation stack. So buyers, property investors are looking for that simple solution, like how close can I get before it's safe to buy in that particular place. And the other thing is, how deep will this be? That was of great concern, for example, to the people in Northbridge, and it's another matter that carries on in the consideration. During the construction period, theoretically possible physical risk could depress the prices, and they've been touched upon, for example, in the reading: structure collapses during tunnelling, groundwater alterations, noise, removal and storage of spoil and materials. And in the scoping reports, for example, that came out in October 2017 about these two sections of the proposed project, there's quite a bit of alarming material if you read that quite carefully, but 24/7 removal of spoil for at least 2 years, and we all know that their best case scenarios, if the light rail project is anything to go by, 2 quickly becomes 5, becomes 7 years. Now, and I'll come to that point later on, when you consider the property life cycle is typically between 7 and 11.2 years, there's an intimate question embedded in this analysis that you may not have that property all that long before you seek to realise it and move it on or flip it or whatever. You could actually find that the property that you buy goes through the entire cycle of construction and spoil removal. That is, when conceived of in that way from a property investment point of view, is a terrifying concept, because nothing is constant. You're at the mercy of these trucks that are working through the night. Vibrations generally, pollution and air and groundwater. There is still litigation on foot concerning the air and groundwater disturbances that occurred during the construction of the Eastern Distributor Tunnel back in the late 1990s. The Inner West case study, as I mentioned earlier, is an interesting, particularly in relation to West Connects. We had occasion to, in the course of publishing another paper, to just see if there was at least an association. It's impossible to say causation and association. It's impossible to say affirmatively that there's a causal connection between the graphs I'm going to show you now and West Connects, save for this thing. Logically, the impact that West Connects had on Inner West property prices was unique in the sense that during the period that I'll show you, there was nothing else but West Connects that could explain quite serious gyrations in the way the Inner West performed relative, for example, to the eastern suburbs and the lower North Shore, which, from the perspective of several property investors, being inner ring circles, are the two nearest rivals to where you are. So if you had a look at the statistics, and here we just use one matrix, and we're no great fan of this particular matrix, but it was a useful way of getting the data. Auction clearance rates produced in those days by the more reliable than it is now, Domain or APM. If you look at the period, the red is the Inner West, the purple is the lower North Shore, and the light blue is the city and the east of the inner eastern suburbs. If you look at the period, and it's quite useful, from February 2014 to April 2015, the Inner West was the standout performer generally in terms of clearance rates and activity. It never dipped, in contrast, for example, to its northern and eastern rivals. Along came the first moment in the life cycle of an infrastructure project, at least as they dealt with in Sydney or in Australia, and that is the great big political announcement to get the attention of the public. And almost immediately, things changed. And what emerged in the Inner West relative to the other two regions was a very, very sharp correction and turn down in the Inner West in the auction clearance rates for no other apparent reason than, and coinciding almost to the day with a couple of key events that occurred in 2014. First was the 14th of December announcement in that year, showing an official government strategy was released showing the actual West Connects, putting some meat on the bones that had been dribbled through the media. Almost to the minute, the clearance rate in the Inner West fell downwards and kept going downwards for the remainder of that calendar year. That trend continued, whereas on the other hand, the other two regions, in fact, showed a reverse. So it actually, it in a sense, reinforced the proposition that something was seriously wrong. What was that certain something from a property price point of view and property interest? 28th of March 2015 was the New South Wales state election, and the Greens candidate there, still a sitting member, was elected on a 60% majority, whose sole platform at that stage was WestConnex. Again, you had a situation where a strong member came in, the Inner West began to recover again, but that steep correction is indicative of, in our view, the sort of impact on an anecdotal level that these sorts of projects can have on property prices and perhaps values in the long term. So it went from WestConnex then, 10 September 2015, of course, it went through a very similar sort of process to the process that you're experiencing at the moment. You have these sort of scoping reports, you have things leaked to the media. Generally, the media tends not to be in favour of these sorts of massive projects. And then you're followed by the eagerly awaited environmental impact study, which is often light on in detail. WestConnex was no exception. So it was released on the 10th of September 2015, and its effect in terms measured, as we were doing by weekly looking at these adjusted clearance rates, was to see the Inner West sustain its position as a laggard relative to the other two regions insofar as auction clearance rates were concerned. And while the rest of the market turned up and everything, it moved very radically from the position it had enjoyed prior to all the brouhaha about WestConnex, and has actually kept that position relative to the other regions as the controversy surrounding WestConnex has continued. After tunnel construction, and of course this is the nirvana or the end point that everyone is looking at in the hope that the whole construction period doesn't overwhelm the property lifestyle, is that in our experience and the reading and literature that we've done in analysing these things and advising people, is that downside risks tend to abate and prices rebound in that transition from the known, known unknown to the known known phase. The clearest example of that, and can be measured in various ways, would be the Eastern Distributor. And in those days, information wasn't as widely disseminated, public interest in these sorts of things wasn't as great as it is today. But at the time, and it remains the case, the Eastern Distributor, albeit a short tunnel, was built is a very complex tunnel, and Noel, I'm sure, knows much more about these things than I do, but in terms of its method of construction, it was unique in the world. It's a piggyback tunnel, so it's a very large tunnel. It required a significant amount of drilling, and it's a very wide tunnel relative even to what's proposed, underneath one of the most densely populated parts of the Sydney metropolitan area. And in those days, and over that period of time, hardly a peep was raised as this thing bore its way through Surrey Hills, Darlinghurst, and Redfern, that sort of area. There were plenty of cracking of terraces and that sort of stuff, but it never really emerged as a major public issue. And now we have a situation where we're 19 years on, I think it's 18 years on since that particular tunnel opened, and billions of dollars worth of property trade, both residential, highly expensive residential property, as well as commercial property, without the idea of this subterranean affectation or its two stacks, and the stacks there are almost exactly 1,000 metres apart. One's at Flinders Street and the other, and it will resonate with people on this side of the bridge, is 40 metres from the entrance to Skeggs Darlinghurst Girls' School entrance. Is just off Stanley Street, and that's the northern stack of the two that service that distributor. Not a peep, we can safely say, is raised in opposition these 19 years on by anyone contemplating buying second-hand stock along the spine of that column, that tunnel, or indeed there's almost an acceptance of the unfiltered stacks on either side. Now, the way in which and it's not necessarily an informed acceptance. I'm not advocating that benign neglect suddenly sets in, you therefore have nothing to worry about here. Our position is very clear. These things are things that warrant serious community engagement and are sources of great concern. But the reality is in the marketplace, and my remit is just property, that's a very interesting case study to say, well, how are we 20 years on when we look at the Eastern Distributor, because it's the closest comparison to what is proposed here at the moment, insofar as it's close to the Sydney CBD. It has 2 stacks instead of 3, and it does involve schools and that sort of thing, and a highly expensive spine underneath which this tunnel was built. And it really doesn't register on the radar at all in the world of property buying. So that leads to the second point. The other thing too is, from a legal point of view, often subterranean resumptions are required as a legal process actually to build these tunnels. Does that resonate with property buyers, the idea that the terra firma beneath your particular property you might lose title to it? Does that impact the price, for example, that you might pay for the property? In our experience, no. If you stop the analysis there, you might say, well, in the long term, either we're all dead, or certainly in terms of these stacks, if they haven't killed us, we haven't got anything to worry about. But in our view, if we look at what's proposed here, recognising that this is very much a moving feast, they are designing this thing on the run, and we don't know the final outcome, and we won't know. The EIS is awaited in July, I think June, July this year. This particular proposal, though, however it's permuted, in our view is different to anything else that we've experienced of the other 5 major tunnel projects in the Sydney metropolitan area. Why is that? The thing that strikes me is and I'm no engineer, but that strikes me as odd, this is the only one, and again talking about these precincts, where you've got 3 stacks so close to each other. If you measure them, doing the best you can, and here we rely quite heavily on the WestConnex interactive map. Our firm has plotted the distance between them, and it would appear that they're essentially in a crescent, the ones proposed for your precincts, and the tunnels are 460 and roughly 330 metres apart from each other. So at the furthest point, Tunnel A and Tunnel B, that's less than 1 kilometre from each other, so a shorter distance, and quite considerably shorter distance when you're looking at particulate tolerance than, for example, exists in the Eastern Distributor, when those tunnels are actually 1 kilometre from each other. So here we've got something, both of these, the tunnels in the centre, are actually less than half a kilometre from each other. Which, logically, and I'm sure Noel will be able to elaborate on this, the logic underlying these tunnels is that you push it up in the air, because it then meets the air, and then you get this dispersion effect, and then it all goes away. Our concern is that if, rather than dispersion, given the close proximity, unique as that proximity is to each other, the dispersion might equals concentration, and in fact, there might be an echo chamber effect in terms of particulate. As the other reason this could be very different to is 11 schools. I'm sure you're all very aware of which they are. I mean, Winona, for example, within 200 metres of a proposed stack in Ridge Street, are a key price driver, particularly for residential property buyers, and particularly those in the prestige end of the market, where we tend to specialise. That is, leaving aside the health things, and Ray's dealt with that, I mean, we have all be justifiably concerned about that, but the notion of having 11 educational establishments across all, from primary school right the way through to tertiary, suddenly impacted by these things, in my view, is a very substantial and material matter to buyers and investors, and it's probably, aside from the health questions per se, is one of the most risky factors that would conspire, I think, to depress property prices here in these precincts as a consequence if these 3 stacks are built. and perhaps displace that sort of blaseness that we see in the Eastern Distributor. As I say, we never see it. I'm not aware of a Skeggs Darlinghurst person or parent being concerned about the fact that one of the stacks is right outside the front door. Doubtless there may be some parents who, were influenced in not sending their daughter to that school by the stack, but if they are, I'm not aware of them. So would it cause an exodus? Time will tell. If there's an exodus, then supply will be in excess of demand, and you would expect prices to be suppressed, at least for a period of time, if that mechanism did emerge.